and welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster preparedness, crisis management, business continuity, resiliency, COVID-19, and anything that's relatable to those topics. Speaking of topics, if there is something you'd like us to talk about on the show, or you'd like to be a guest on the show, please go to the VoiceAmerica page for Preparing for the Unexpected, and underneath the graphic, there is a button that allows you to send me an email. I do get all emails, and I do respond to everything I get. If you want to promote a product or service on the show, either speaking or advertising, please reach me the same way, and I can send you some information on that. A reminder to everybody who might be participating and listening in on BCI World, the virtual conference, November 5th and 6th. I will be presenting at that conference. I believe I'm speaking on November 5th, so hopefully you can listen into that. And I'd like to thank everybody at Stone Road for their product, Boast Assessment, which is a application. You can answer a bunch of questions and find out where you need to focus your resources for your business continuity programs, where your plans might be lacking, things to consider. So thanks to everyone at Stone Road. Now, to today's show. Today's show, first of all, as you know, I'm an avid reader. I've said it many times, I love to read. And today's topic, we're actually kind of be covering two things that I've wanted to talk about on the show for quite some time. I came across a book, and I read the title, and I'll give that in a moment. But the comments were saying that, hey, this book is really good. It's not just for who the book says it's for. It's full of great information. So I got the book, I went through it, and went, this is perfect. I want to speak to this author. So joining me from Serbia today is the author of Disaster Preparedness for Women, and I'd like to welcome to the show Diane Vukovic. Diane, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Could you kind of give us a little bit of a bio on yourself, things you've done and how you got into what you do?
Well, I'm originally from upstate New York, from a very outdoorsy family. I grew up going backpacking and camping with my dad. I think I started carrying my own pack up mountains when I was 6 years old. We did a lot of orienteering, if you know what that sport is. Mm-hmm. Basically running through the woods with a map and a compass, trying to get to places in the fastest amount of time. I'd make forts and shelters in the woods in my backyard all day long. I'm also an avid traveler. Been to like 34 countries on 5 continents, including a lot of poor countries where they don't necessarily have running water or stable electricity. And I really like the Balkans, so I decided to move to Serbia about 10 years ago. And flash forward some time, I've got 2 children, and I started taking them camping and backpacking as well. And that's what really got me into prepping, because I was going out into the wilderness with my daughter, hours away from civilization. And it dawned on me that I was completely responsible for her if something went wrong, and that there'd be no help available. Mm-hmm. So I started learning about things like wilderness survival and first aid, and that eventually got me into other areas of prepping.
Well, that's and is that how the book came about? Disaster preparedness for women. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, some of the comments about the book were saying, even though it's got 4 women in the title, it's really knowledgeable for just about anybody. There's a couple of specific spots, obviously, but it's really quite full of great ideas for people in general. Is that how the book came about?
Well, the book is more focused on what you traditionally consider a disaster, like hurricanes and earthquakes. But a lot of those same disaster preparedness techniques can also be applied to many other areas. Even things like doing a job interview. There's tricks that will help you be ready for those situations, even for being prepared for stressful days and being able to cope with that better. Those same skills translate into preparing for disasters and actually acting appropriately if a disaster does occur.
Now, you mentioned the word prepper, and I let's face it, when we hear that word, we're thinking of, The Walking Dead, that kind of thing. What really is a prepper to you?
A
And what
prepper
is it
is
not?
someone who recognizes that bad things can happen and wants to take reasonable measures to be ready for them. And interestingly, I find that there's a lot of crossover with prepping and other groups that we don't necessarily consider to be preppers. Like, for example, there's a huge urban gardening and backyard chicken movement going on right now. And that is right in line with preppers. Same with hippies, who basically started the off-grid movement. That's also prepping. If you've got an off-grid system, you're ready for a large-scale power outage, for example. So I think my favorite example of kind of these crossover of people who are preppers without realizing them is when I was in college, I was hanging out with a lot of anarchist punk type groups that were squatting abandoned buildings. Well, squatting meant that they had to figure out things like compost toilets, generators, solar power, making food out of dumpster diving. I think a lot of these people would do much better than the standard preppers if a large-scale disaster did happen, but they're not considered preppers.
Well, Hollywood would have us believe that a prepper is, kind of a psychotic person with a machine gun buried in a bunker. But you don't speak like that in your book.
No. I think a big problem is reality TV. There's the show Doomsday Preppers, which they showed a lot of extreme people who were going very overboard and not necessarily being logical in the way that they approached preparedness as part of their everyday life. Like people spending their money in bunkers and ammo instead of taking a vacation, or people who are moving away into the wilderness and forsaking social lives. So there's also the survivalist reality TVs didn't help either, like Bear Grylls doing things like drinking urine, eating raw meat without cooking it first. There's an episode where he's like swinging over a gorge on a vine. It's none of those things are smart to do in a real survival situation.
So based on that, what gave you the idea to write Disaster Preparedness specifically for women? What was missing? What did you find? You information that wasn't available somewhere else?
Well, I've been writing for a website called primalsurvivor.net for over 5 years now, which means that I spend a lot of time on prepper websites, reading prepper books, and a lot of groups and forums. And I got really sick of the machismo in these groups. A lot of times you'll hear comments that women are extra baggage that need to be protected. When women try to contribute ideas, they're often dismissed. It's not just women. A lot of times minority groups are also dismissed and not welcome in the groups. And I also had a big issue with the very narrow view of prepping that is presented in most prepping communities. Most people are prepping for doomsday or the end of the world as we know it, but they're not necessarily prepping for a short-term emergency like a blizzard, which is not necessarily. If you're not prepared for a blizzard, how are you supposed to get prepared for the end of the world? It's a bit overwhelming. Another thing you'll see in these prepper communities, which drives me crazy, is what I like to call the lone wolf approach to prepping, which is each person for himself. So the idea that you've got to be ready to flee into the wilderness at the first sign of disaster and live off of your wits and shoot anybody who comes around. I've even heard men in the prepping forum say things that they don't need to stockpile food because they're stockpiling weapons, because they could just go and shoot somebody and take whatever they need. So I know that most people, and especially women, don't feel comfortable in this prepping world. And it's also not realistic for a lot of people. For example, I'm not going to be bugging out into the wilderness with a newborn. So I decided to write a book for people who want to be prepared, but to take a more level-headed approach to it, and without all the politics and macho rhetoric. So there's also some very specific advice for women in the book, which tends to get overlooked, like how to deal with your periods, how to deal with contraception and rape, which are very real issues that women have to face, unfortunately, in disaster times.
And those were some of the sections that I mentioned in my opening that specifically address women. But everything else you said outside of those really makes sense in general for everybody. Preparing for a storm. If you've got, like I do here, if I've got a couple of jugs of water extra, that doesn't make me someone who's afraid of a nuclear apocalypse. I'm just prepared for a winter storm in case my pipes freeze or something.
Exactly.
It's kind of, being logically prepared.
Yeah, and statistically, these things happen, and they happen quite frequently. And, hopefully people don't have to learn the hard way to stockpile the basics. Right now, FEMA recommends having a minimum of 2 weeks of supplies at home, which is an update from their previous recommendation of just having 3 days. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the future they update that recommendation to be at least a month worth of supplies.
I was just curious, any idea why they increased that from 3 days to 2 weeks?
Experience. There's been numerous hurricanes over the past several years, and they haven't been able to organize quickly enough to get supplies to everybody. So even a lot of the evacuation shelters don't necessarily have supplies on hand and don't get them right away. So if you're just have 3 days worth of food and water at your home, it might not be enough. Not to mention all the things that you might need, for heating your home, going to the bathroom, hygiene, medicines.
Well, with COVID-19, that's also going to add other challenges because I've heard shelters, in some places there's more of them, but they have to spread people out, because the fear of people catching, coronavirus.
Yeah, now we have a unique situation of 2 separate disasters happening at once, hurricanes and wildfires right now, along with COVID.
Now, so that's that kind of touches on one of the things we were going to talk about, like disaster mitigation. What kind of disaster should we consider? I know you mentioned snowstorms, but what kind of things should we consider if at home? I mentioned I have water here in case my pipes freeze or something because I'm in Canada, of course. So, but what kind of disasters should we do, and what kind of things should we consider?
The first step is to do some research about the area that you live in and see which disasters are most likely to hit. So, if you're in the southeast United States, obviously that's going to be hurricanes. You have tornadoes, earthquakes, power outages are common everywhere, and flooding is becoming increasingly more common. And once you kind of make this list of disasters that are most likely in your area, you can start doing some research and making a plan for getting reasonably prepared. And that plan should focus on 3 things. The first is the things you can do before the emergency happens, the things you do while it's actually happening, and any steps that you would need to take after the emergency occurs. For example, with earthquakes, beforehand, you can do things to earthquake-proof your home, like not hanging heavy items over top of your bed. During the actual earthquake, knowing what position to take. And afterwards, knowing the steps, like after an earthquake, you should put on boots and work gloves if there's damage, so you don't step on glass. And in case there's an aftershock, that you're ready with your boots on. You knowing how to check your utilities to make sure that they're okay, and if you suspect a gas leak, that you turn the gas off, and knowing how to perform basic first aid if somebody got injured. So that would be just one example of kind of making an outline of a plan for how you can be prepared.
Listening to you, some of that sounds so simple, yet really, I don't think a lot of people think, on that kind of a level.
That is one of my strengths, is taking complicated issues and breaking them down into simple steps. And that's one of the things I did with the book. I broke down complete disaster preparedness into 52 steps, starting with, the plans, making space in your home. That's a big step that people forget. You start stockpiling a lot of items and then don't have anywhere to put it. And then going through all of the essentials, from getting items, storing them, mental preparedness, self-protection. So it's really not that complicated so long as you start with a plan.
And we're going to talk about that in just a moment because we've come to the end of our first segment. Today we are talking with Diane Vukovic, the author of Disaster Preparedness for Women. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. Today we are talking with Diane Vukovic, the author of Disaster Preparedness for Women. Diane, lots of great information in the first segment. Thank you. Let's say some of our listeners are out there, thinking, okay, well then what do I need to do to get started? How do I plan? What do I need? What kind of things do I need to consider?
All right. Well, the first thing I'd say is don't just rush out and buy a lot of things before you've made a plan, which includes lists of what you want to buy. Because I find a lot of people will read articles about earthquakes, solar flares, whatever, and then out of fear, start buying a lot of random supplies. So fear-based buying doesn't work and you lose momentum really quickly. Regardless of what disaster you're preparing for, I find that you can break down everything into 7 main categories. And it's really important that you cover all of the categories. For example, the first category is food and water. That's the one that most people really like to focus on and have huge stockpiles of beans, rice, freeze-dried meals. And that's great, except if your electricity's out, how are you going to cook all of those beans and rice that you stockpiled? So the next category would be cooking. So having some sort of stove that you can use when the power is out, like a bottle of propane with a little stove that you can attach to it. Or if you live somewhere where it makes sense to cook outdoors, you can even have an outdoor cooking stove. The third category is heating and warmth, or depending on where you live, it could even mean cooling. So having things like sleeping bags, a little portable heater that you can use, wood for your fireplace, or if you have a wood-burning stove. Actually, when I was a child, there was a huge blizzard in upstate New York. We had 5 feet of snow and power out for about 2 or 3 weeks. But I actually really enjoyed that time because my whole family kind of came together in one room. We had enough wood for the fire, had a generator, and so I look back at that as a nice time. But if we didn't have a way to heat the house, I might have been traumatized by that experience. Mm-hmm. The fourth category is power. So on a basic level, that's having flashlights and batteries stored for, power goes out in almost all sorts of disaster situations. On next level, having something like a solar panel or even a hand crank generator or an actual generator. For example, if you have medical devices that need to stay powered, keeping your phones powered. The fifth category is health and hygiene. And with the pandemic, we saw a lot of this, the shortages of hand sanitizer and N95 masks. And I'd like to add that the N95 masks aren't just for pandemics. In, for example, a hurricane situation where there's a lot of damage, it unearths a lot of asbestos. So that was a huge problem in New Jersey when they were hit by earthquakes and people were going to clean up and they didn't have masks to wear. So they're exposing themselves to harmful chemicals. So you need to have those masks there and possibly even goggles to keep yourself safe, as well as a first aid kit so you can handle basic, if not more severe injuries at home. Mm-hmm. The sixth category is evacuation supplies. Every single thing you need to be able to leave at a moment's notice. And the final category is personal safety, which is weapons, self-defense training, things like being able to board up your windows if you have to leave, so your house is less likely to be burglarized. And that's it, 7 categories, and it covers all aspects of disaster prepping.
Now, there's a couple that I kind of want us to zero in on. And when we were chatting before, back and forth, you mentioned that mental preparation is a big piece. Can you talk a little bit more about mental preparation, for this kind of thing?
Yes. By mental preparedness, I mean being able to deal with obstacles as they come and to adapt to them. So simply put, it's about not freaking out or freezing up. So it's very important because a plan is useless if you aren't in the mental state to act on it. And we actually do a lot of mental preparedness training. For example, in schools, we have fire drills. That's a form of mental preparedness. So that way, when the alarm rings, all the children know to line up and to leave the building calmly. And unfortunately, the preparedness kind of stops after school. Very few businesses actually do fire drills for their employees. Nevertheless, hurricane drills, tornado drills, earthquakes, it doesn't happen. So this is any sort of drills that you can practice in your everyday life will do wonders for preparing for emergencies.
Well, I know my last contract, the facility did do fire drills, but I'll be honest, most of the people within the building just went, "Oh, here we go," and didn't really pay attention to where they should go. They just kind of followed. Oh, everyone's heading that direction. Fine, I'll just go there, and then just waited till paid attention to what was going on.
Yeah. Well, at least they left, so that's something. Yeah. But it's sad how little effort we take to prepare for these emergencies, which actually do happen quite frequently. And even if we're told what to do, how quickly we forget it. Like if you go to YouTube and type in earthquake footage, you'll see the ground starts trembling. Everything's swaying there, and the people are just standing there clueless with what to do. Nobody's ducking, nobody's taking cover, nobody's getting out from underneath the power lines. And these are the things that we really need to practice so that it's ingrained in our muscle memory and we can do it without thinking. But there's some things, though, that realistically we're not going to do drills for. And for those situations, there's a different type of mental preparedness technique that's great. It's called emergency conditioning. It's actually what the military uses to get soldiers ready for combat. And it basically involves imagining a disaster in extreme detail. So you're imagining what it would look like around you, how it would smell if there was, for example, a fire approaching, how you would feel with your heart racing from the adrenaline. And you go through it, close your eyes and imagine yourself going through the disaster. I'll give you an example of how I used this recently, luckily, which I didn't actually have to use. But here in Serbia, at the start of the pandemic, every single person that got confirmed diagnosis of corona was being sent to one of those impromptu hospitals that were pretty scary looking. And me as an adult, I like to think that I would handle that fairly well. But my older daughter is 10 years old, and that could be very scary for her. All of a sudden, going to the doctor's office, getting a test, and then being rushed off to some weird building with a bunch of people in what looks like hazmat suits, completely covered, and people around you coughing, the lack of privacy, the wool blankets that are rough to the touch. So to get my daughter prepared for that possibility, we looked at photos of the different types of hospitals. We talked over what the doctors would be wearing, what the schedule would be like there, how it would smell terrible probably, how we would be standing in line for the bathrooms and to be washing our hands, the bad food. And an interesting thing about the mental preparation process when you do this emergency conditioning is as you're going through the steps of imagining what would happen in that scenario, you're actually realizing like any holes that are in your plan. So, for example, as my daughter and I were going over, this is what it would be like in this hospital. Okay, it's like, okay, well, we should maybe bring some earplugs and eye masks so that way we can sleep better without having to have the fluorescent lights blaring at us and listening to people around us cough. It's going to be boring in there, and there's a limited amount of electrical sockets. Let's pack a splitter for the, when those electrical splitters in the emergency case, so that way we can keep our phones plugged in and not have to fight with whoever's sharing the room with us over the limited electrical sockets. And we actually have a much better plan. And had we needed to go to the hospital there, it wouldn't have been so traumatic because our brains would have already gone through the process when we imagined it.
So it seems by you talking with your daughter, using that example, before things happen, communication, talking with people, saying this is what could happen, the potential what ifs and, the ramifications of that. And also letting people, I'm sure your daughter asked you questions, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So she's able to ask questions back to you. I find with many organizations and communities, sometimes they don't want to talk about things because they're too afraid of upsetting people. And we were actually even seen that in the headlines lately with COVID-19. People don't want to talk about things because they don't want to scare people. But by us not knowing, wouldn't that just scare us more?
Exactly. And if we do find ourselves in that situation, it's not only do we not know what to do, but we're less likely to make good decisions. And, or if you do know what to do, you're more likely to freeze up. Like I said, if you haven't done a fire drill and you've only read that if you hear the alarm gun, you should quickly walk out. If you haven't done the fire drill, when you hear it, you might just continue sitting there. Or you might freak out and start running out the door. You might take the elevator instead of the steps. That's why we need to do drills. And if you can't do the drill, you do the emergency conditioning tactics to kind of put yourself through it so you can react properly without even having to think and not freak out. This method is actually great for a lot of things in everyday life. Like if you have to do a job interview, you imagine what it's going to be like sitting there with the people, what questions they're going to ask you, and then you're going to be less likely to freeze up in that stressful situation because you've gone through it in your mind, if not practiced it out loud with a partner.
And I think that's a key point there too, because in the business continuity industry or disaster planning, emergency management, whatever you want to call those areas, they have to practice their plans and get people knowledgeable of what to happen, because they know if they don't, then some of the examples you just gave, people freezing or panicking, can cause more problems than what you actually have occurring to start with.
Yes, exactly. So there's a lot of ways you can practice this in your everyday life and apply it and with business, but really to kind of break down all of the bad things that can happen. And it doesn't make you a negative thinker. I know our Western culture really prizes positive thinking, and even bringing up the possibility that something bad can happen is considered bad. And my husband's like this. He really doesn't like thinking about all the bad things that can happen. And it only took, we had some bad flooding here and an earthquake, a mild one, luckily, and now Corona. And it's like, okay, we're going to sit here and go through all of the bad things that can happen and what we would do in these scenarios. And afterwards, you feel more relaxed. It's scary bringing up all these things, but really, if you're scared, it probably means that you're not prepared for it.
Well, it's kind of like those old G.I. Joe cartoons, knowing is half the battle.
Okay, I definitely did not watch G.I. Joe cartoons, but
I saw.
Okay, but you gotta take it one step. Knowing is part of the battle, but knowing and not acting on what you know is you've got to take some steps to be prepared. So not just mentally. Once you've gone through the mental conditioning, aware that something bad can happen, and seeing all the things that can go wrong, the next step is to really, what can you do to prevent that, or when it does happen, to make it so the situation doesn't come out as bad. So if we ended up getting corona, which we haven't yet, luckily, and had gone to the terrible hospital, at least we would have been comfortable. We had a special corona bag packed for that, with, the earplugs, the splitter. I even put a little tiny tent in there so we could have some privacy if we wanted to. These sort of things.
Well, we're going to talk about that part in the next section, what you call the go bag. We're going to talk about that in our next segment. So we're going to end our second segment. We are talking today with the author of Disaster Preparedness for Women, Diane Vukovic, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. We are talking with Diane Vukovic, the author of Disaster Preparedness for Women. Diane, again, another great segment in segment 2 there. A lot of what you said, and I happened to just mention it during the break here to you, is there's a lot of risk management and risk mitigation in what you're saying. And that's exactly what happens in my business continuity management disaster planning area. And it's interesting how the two never get together. And as you said during the break, it's, people tend to see prepping as, like that stereotypical Hollywood apocalyptic type of view. So I'm really finding what you're saying very interesting. And, I'm enjoying this quite a bit. Now, let's jump to what happens when we have to flee? What do we do? What should we consider? And what should we have ready for us?
All right. The first thing I want to say about that is that it is very hard to think rationally when you are in the midst of a disaster. So ideally, you should make a set of rules before the disaster strikes. And these rules will be, for example, in what conditions will you evacuate? And you need to have several sets of rules based on different scenarios. For example, is your entire family going to evacuate together? Or will one family member stay at home and lock up while the others evacuate with, the kids and grandma? Will you finish the work week if it's not an immediate disaster? A lot of people, their employers actually don't let them evacuate early. So are you willing to risk losing your job if your employer says that you're not allowed to evacuate? These are kind of the individual things that you need to ask yourself. So that way, when there's the hurricane warning in place or whatever the situation is, that you've made the plan ahead of time. And so there's no questioning it. You're not acting on emotions. So you know exactly what you're going to do in which situation and stick to those rules.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also talk about, in your book, a go bag. What is that and what should it contain?
The go bag, the idea behind it is that it contains everything you need to survive for at least 3 days until you can get to safety. In the prepping community, they usually talk about a go bag, or as they call it, a bug out bag, as things that you need to survive in the wilderness for 3 days. And in some cases, depending on where you live, that might be completely legit. But for a lot of people, evacuating might just mean driving your car to a relative's house who lives further away, or if it's a larger scale disaster, it might mean, 3 days of driving or a really long bus ride to get to a different property you own or other family. So everybody's go bag is going to look a little bit different based on what disasters you're preparing for, where you're planning on going, and how far away it is.
Are there any things that, we should, how do I put this, that sometimes we forget about? Put it that way, when it comes to, evacuating, that people often forget about these three things, or, anything, any suggestions?
Well, when making your go plan, your evacuation plan, first thing you guys should think about is where you're going to go. That sounds obvious, but a lot of people don't actually think about it. If there's a hurricane versus a large-scale grid outage, where are you going to go? Are you going to go to an evacuation shelter locally? The second thing, how are you going to get there? And do you have a backup plan? Because roads often become inaccessible. If you're planning on flying out of a disaster zone to get to family's house or whatever, that might not be possible because flights get booked really quickly. Third thing, how are you going to pay for it? For hurricanes, I read that the average cost of evacuation is $1,000, which is, and especially when you start calculating like lost work time, nights in hotels, and we're not even talking about actual damage that might be done and if you can't return home. So you've really got to consider how you pay for it. A big thing that people don't think about also is how they're going to get in contact with family members. Mobile phones often aren't working when there's a disaster because of call overload. So do you have a backup plan about how you would get in contact with people? And if you're sitting around at home waiting for a family member to come before you leave, you're losing valuable time. And your family member might be stuck somewhere. They might already be in safety. And then finally, you have the things that you actually need to bring and the things that you should pack in your go bag.
Well, I'm happy to say I have a go bag in my closet right beside the extra water in case something happens. I have to leave. There's first aid stuff in there, medicine, which gets rotated, that I have to take. So, I'm like to think I'm prepared. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Now,
I kind of
go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say that for the items in the go bag, again, I'm a big list person, so I've divided these into kind of 8 main categories, and the one being food and water, some bottled water and non-perishable food. I've also got a water purification system in my go bag. Got to have appropriate clothing. For example, if you're in a flood area, having some waterproof boots next to your go bag is a great thing to have, so you don't have to be walking through nasty sewage water. Hygiene items, toothbrushes, toilet paper, wet wipes, menstrual cup if you're a woman, or tampons, whatever. Your health items, again, the N95 masks are great. Even wildfires now, you would want to include some goggles in your go bag so your eyes aren't being singed while fleeing. Fifth category, shelter and warmth. I've got a lightweight tent and some sleeping bags and sleeping pads in my go bag. Some survivalists just bring a tarp. That's, even if you end up going to an emergency shelter, having those sleeping bags and pads are really nice. They often don't have any sort of blankets for everyone there. The sixth category, communication, having some sort of emergency radio so you can stay in touch with the news, your phone, a spare charger, power banks, a little solar panel. A big thing that people forget, and is actually honestly a pain in the butt to compile, but all of your documents, copies of your IDs, your insurance policies, your bank account numbers. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, there were so many scammers that they started requiring ID for some people to get help. And a lot of people also had problems receiving money from family members through Western Union or whatever because they didn't have their IDs with them. So it's good to have maybe even some originals, but copies of your documents on a USB, and also keeping them in the cloud, make your life a lot easier later on. And then the final category is those random tools and gear that you might need, like a waterproof sack, self-defense items, duct tape's always useful, rope, like if you want to make a clothesline, cash and small bills, flashlight, all these kind of random items that you might need depending on your disaster.
Well, I'm glad to say that my bag has all of those things, except for the wet boots. I don't have those, but I've got winter boots. Being in Canada, that's why.
How much you're getting in your area? I live in an area that sometimes floods, and I see those photos of people evacuating, like up in knee-height water. Oh, so disgusting. There's so much nasty sewage and chemicals and everything in that water. So
yeah, if
you really live somewhere that's going to be hit by hurricanes, you got to get yourself one of those like fisherman overalls, like that's a complete dry.
Yeah.
I do not want to be walking through sewage. It's actually after hurricanes, one of the biggest problems people have are like skin rashes and diarrheal diseases because of contact with all of the sewage and water.
Yeah.
No one likes talking about that, but yeah, that's actually the biggest risk after a hurricane is diarrhea and rashes. So.
Yeah, and maybe that's why so many people end up suffering because no one talks about it.
Yeah, it's not a sexy topic like solar panels.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we've only got half our segment left, but I want to touch on something specifically in your book, and that's the situational awareness rape prevention. Can you speak to that?
Okay, well, this is something that's very personal to me because I've been sexually assaulted 3 times in my life. Once when I was 8 years old from a family friend, again when I was 14 from a work colleague, and about a decade ago while traveling had to fight off a guy. So yes, unfortunately, this is something that affects a lot of women. I mean, of course, men get raped and assaulted too, but I think we can all agree that this is something that disproportionately affects women. But depending on the statistics, it's like 1 in 3 to 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime.
What should women do to, I guess I'll just use the situational awareness. How can they overcome some of this?
Okay, well, traditionally, rape prevention and self-defense goes into one of 2 categories, and neither of these are good options. The first option is learning how to fight. And yes, that's useful, knowing how to kick someone in the groin or, where to hit them in the shins or nose. That's great. But not all women are physically able to put up a fight. I took a Krav Maga class with one woman who had a brittle bone disease. She realistically is not going to be fighting off any large attacker. She would be seriously injured by putting up any sort of fight. So, and even me, I've had some self-defense training. A lot of that's going to be useless against an armed or very strong or skilled attacker. So that's not a good option. Mm-hmm. The second thing that's usually recommended is rules to follow. And all of these rules start with never. Like never walk alone at night, never get drunk at parties, and never wear revealing clothing or never talk to strangers. I personally have a huge issue with these rules for women that we're supposed to follow, mainly because it puts the burden on us as women to not get raped when it should be men's burden not to rape women. And it breeds a culture of fear where a lot of women avoid doing activities because they're too scared. Like I've been asked countless times whether I was scared to travel or to go backpacking as a woman alone. And men do not get asked these questions. They get asked how the trip was. They don't get asked, were they scared? So if these 2 approaches don't work, here's what I say does work. It's, for starters, acknowledging that the vast majority of rapes occur by people we know, which was my case in 2 out of the 3 situations. With the third one, too, it was a bad date and shattered his ego, and I got attacked because of it. So It's not strangers lurking out of dark alleys attacking women. It's usually people like our bosses or colleagues or sadly even family members. So we really need to address that if we want to not get raped. And unfortunately, women are told from childhood that they need to be polite. And, I'm not sure how much you're aware of this as a man, but women will relate to the need to put other people's feelings and needs over our own. We don't want to hurt people's feelings. We'll often do things that we don't want to because it's easier than making a big deal out of it. And that's why we have situations where women are being touched inappropriately at work, but they don't say anything. They're telling themselves in their heads, this is probably a misunderstanding, and I don't want to embarrass him by asking him to stop. Never mind the fact that they feel really uncomfortable. They're too worried about embarrassing the man who's putting his hand on their shoulders and then up their legs. So,
well, I know this is tough for you to talk about, and but I really do appreciate you sharing that personal story and talking to us about that. We've only got a minute or so left. Do you have any closing comments that you'd like to make?
On the terms of not getting raped, I would say that women should really learn to stop being so polite. That most rapes start with crossing boundaries in small ways that don't seem like they're big deals. But if you let one boundary be crossed and you don't say no, then another one's going to happen, and the next thing you know, you're being attacked, and you still are saying no. So you've really got to overcome these social cues, and you don't have to be polite. Practice saying no in your everyday life.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our show. Diane, thank you, first of all, for sharing your personal story. I know that can't be easy, but thank you very much. And congratulations on your book, Disaster Preparedness for Women. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.